500 degrees centigrade in any given year. And if the temperature of the Earth were to go up and down by 200 degrees in any given year, then all life would vanish. That's why it's much nicer to live near the ocean, right? Because the temperature is much more stable. So the same molecule that has the right boiling and freezing point properties is also the same molecule that has the right solvent properties, is also the molecule that has the right specific heat properties. Now, water has another very odd property that is very unusual, and that property is this. Oops, let me go back there. Water has the property that the solid floats on top of the liquid, right? Ice floats on water, correct? Guess what? There are tens of millions of molecules, and how many of those molecules do you think have the property that the solid floats on top of the liquid? The answer is only one. Water is completely unique in that property. Why is that important? Now, I know that you live in Ghana, so it doesn't ever get very cold here. But in cold areas of the world, in the winter, what happens is the colder ice floats on top of the warmer water. And what that does, it prevents the lake from freezing to the bottom in the winter. All right? Now, you'd say, well, that doesn't affect us here in Ghana, but it turns out during ice ages, the oceans would freeze all the way to the bottom, and it would end life on the Earth. Now, another property that water has, another unique property, every other substance has the property of, if you do density versus temperature, as the temperature goes up, the density goes down. Every single substance has that property. Guess how many exceptions there are? Only one, and that's water. For water, as you lower the temperature, the density goes up, but then below 4 degrees, the density of water actually drops. Totally unique. Why is that important? Because otherwise, what would happen is in the winter, you have the ice on top, and then you have the colder water on top and the warmer water below. Ice is not a good conductor of heat. Water is. And again, this protects the lakes from freezing. And during ice ages, it would protect the oceans from freezing to the bottom. There are several other properties that water has, its viscosity and other properties, all of which are essential to life. In every case, if water didn't have that property, then there'd be no life. And the point is, water has all of these properties. Why is it that one compound has all of these properties? Now, one argument is, well, no particular reason, we just got lucky. But again, arguing for luck on this is pushing it a lot, in my opinion. If that was the only example, I don't know, maybe the atheists might possibly have a case, although I doubt it. Now, let's go to the next thing. Oops, let's see here. My PowerPoint stopped forwarding for some reason. This happens sometimes, so sorry about that. I'm going to have to briefly leave the PowerPoint and restart it so that I can continue using it. Sorry about that, folks. So here we go. Stop sharing. All right. Then I have to go to this PowerPoint, escape, close it down. Just give me a second here. It won't take long at all. All right. And I go to the PowerPoint. Sorry about that, folks. Here we go. Come on now. There we go. I don't know why it does this sometimes, but it just does. All right. Show. Okay, great. Let's see if we get lucky. Oh, yeah, we did. All right. So again, we talked about the properties of water. Now let's go to the next slide. Now there's a periodic chart. I'm guessing all of you have seen a periodic chart at some point or other. Some of you may get very nervous and start breaking out in hives and start sweating when you see the periodic chart. Now, when I teach chemistry, I tell my students that this chart was invented by a guy named Mendeleev, Dmitry Mendeleev, a Russian chemist. About 4 years ago, I was blessed. I was able to teach in the same auditorium that Mendeleev taught in, which is kind of fun. So I tell my students that this chart was invented by Mendeleev, but I say, as a scientist, I say, that Mendeleev didn't invent this chart, that God invented this chart. In fact, God's fingerprints are all over this chart. There are at least 20 elements that I know of that have a property that no other element has. And if that element didn't have that property, there'd be no life on the earth. All right. And so you could argue for random luck or accident, but I'd say no. In fact, I say to the atheist, why are there so many elements? Explain this. Well, they talk about quantum numbers, but why are there quantum numbers? Why do we have so many elements? Again, when we ask the big question about why, the atheist is left without answers. Now, one of those elements that has properties unique to it that no other element has is carbon. I teach organic chemistry. And when I teach organic chemistry, I spend the first 2 days just talking about the elements that carbon has that no other element has. And every single one of those properties, if carbon didn't have those properties, there'd be no life. So I say carbon is beautifully and wonderfully designed. My students figure out pretty quickly that I'm a believer. All right. And this is a great example. Now, one example is carbon, as you can see in the picture on the left, forms 4 bonds. Now, actually, carbon is not the only element that forms 4 bonds. There's actually 2 elements that form 4 bonds. Those are carbon and silicon. You see where silicon is on the chart there, right below carbon? The fact that it's below carbon explains why it forms 4 bonds. But anyway, the problem with silicon is if you put 2 silicon atoms together in the same molecule, that molecule explodes. It's not stable. All right. Now, why 4 bonds? Why is that important? Well, if an element forms 1 bond, the molecules are linear. If an element forms 2 bonds, the molecule is planar. If the element forms 3 bonds, the molecule is planar. But science tells us you have to have 4 bonds in order to have a 3-dimensional molecule. And if you don't have a 3-dimensional molecule, then you don't have 3-dimensional life. So the only element that is capable of forming 3-dimensional molecules is carbon. All right. Not only that, not only is carbon the only element that forms 3-dimensional molecules, it's also the only element that forms large molecules. And you can see in the picture on the right, the black balls represent carbon atoms. There's a molecule with what, maybe, I don't know, 20, 25 carbon atoms. No other element forms large molecules. It just so happens the only element that has 4 bonds is also the only element that forms large molecules. And if the element that has 4 bonds and therefore is 3-dimensional did not also form large molecules, again, there'd be no life. Now, this organic chemistry class, I talk about the fact that carbon forms rings, it forms single, double, and triple bonds, several other properties unique to carbon, without which there'd be no life. But I'm going to skip to my next element. That element, let's go back to the chart, is iron. You see iron on the chart? Fe. Iron has a property that no other element has, which is iron forms a strong magnetic field. Why is that important? Well, it turns out the sun produces different kinds of energy. Roughly 80% of all the energy produced by the sun is visible light. Lucky for us, because visible light is the only kind of energy, the only kind of light that can initiate chemical reactions without destroying molecules. Lucky for us. But there are 2 kinds of energy that comes from the sun. One is ultraviolet radiation. The other one is the cosmic wind, the solar wind, both of which would destroy life. So God invented 2 different elements, each of which to deal with those 2 different kinds of energy. The first is the solar wind, which is very high energy particles of protons and electrons. And it turns out the magnetic field of the earth, which is due to the iron in the earth, acts literally as a force field that bends those particles around the earth. Now, as you're probably aware, humans want to go to Mars, but it turns out in order to do that, one of the things you have to do is you have to build essentially a force field around that capsule to prevent the occupants from being killed from the solar wind. All right, now here's the thing. Iron has this one property, which is that it's the only element that forms a strong magnetic field. But it has another property, which is iron has the most stable nucleus of all the elements. That's why the Earth is made up of primarily iron. In other words, if iron was magnetic, but it wasn't also the most stable element, it wouldn't do us any good. What's the Earth made out of mostly? Iron. Why is the Earth made out of iron mostly? Because it's the most stable element. So the same element that has the property of magnetism, which protects life from solar wind, just so happens to be the most stable element. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Okay, another element we could talk about that has unique properties. We could talk about hydrogen, we could talk about helium, etc. But instead, let's talk about oxygen. Oxygen is a very interesting element because it has two stable forms. One of it, O2, that we call oxygen, that form of oxygen is the only gas that can support high metabolism life. So O2 is the form of oxygen that allows animals to exist and high metabolism life forms. But oxygen has another form, O3, ozone. Now, ozone is poisonous. In fact, if ozone existed in the lower atmosphere, it would kill everybody. But almost all the ozone in the Earth's atmosphere is in the upper atmosphere, and it has the property of absorbing ultraviolet light. So oxygen, the existence of oxygen allows ultraviolet light to be absorbed. Otherwise, all life would be destroyed. Okay, another element that has unique properties is uranium. You're probably aware that uranium is radioactive, correct? Well, it turns out, actually, surprisingly, uranium is not all that radioactive. Pure uranium is not very radioactive simply because it has a very, very long half-life. The half-life of uranium is roughly 4.5 billion years. Lucky for us, because the Earth is around 4.5 billion years old, and roughly half the uranium that was in the Earth at the beginning is still there. Why is that important? Because it's giving off this radioactive energy. That's why the Earth is hot in the middle. And if uranium was not radioactive with a very, very long half-life, then the Earth would be cold and solid all the way to the center. You think, well, that's a good idea. No, that's a really bad idea, because the heat released by this radioactive uranium is what causes plate tectonics. And plate tectonics is like a massive recycling system so that the minerals on the surface of the Earth are recycled. Otherwise, the living things on the Earth would use up those minerals, and then the Earth would be, if it weren't for plate tectonics, the Earth would not have an atmosphere. Well, that's probably pretty important. In fact, if you want to live on a planet with almost no uranium, go to Mars. There's very little uranium in Mars. Mars, therefore, has no plate tectonics. It has basically no atmosphere, and basically the surface is sterile, and good luck farming on Mars. Another property of uranium, by the way, is uranium is very, very dense. It's one of the most dense of all the elements, which is why, guess where almost all the uranium is? Down in the center of the Earth, producing heat so that we can have life on this planet, rather than near the surface, where it'd be a bit of a problem for us. Again, uranium is wonderfully and beautifully designed. Otherwise, there'd be no life on the Earth. Okay, I could talk about other elements that are designed for life, but let's go on to biochemistry. I'm assuming that everybody here has had at least some biology in their high school biology class, and you're aware of DNA. Now, DNA is the information-containing molecule in all living things. You see a picture of it on the left, but on the right, you can see those G's and C's and A's and T's. Well, it turns out there are 4 different nucleotides in nucleic acid. And any set of 3 of them, like GGC or GTA, each of these are a code that chooses the amino acids so that DNA can be used to produce proteins. All right, so DNA has this built-in code. All right, that's the nuclear code that allows living things to generate proteins. I've got a question for you. Pretty simple question. Does it make any sense that molecules just randomly bumping into each other could create a code? My answer to that is no, that makes no sense. The very code that allows information to be carried and to reproduce in different living things is the result of a molecule that couldn't possibly have arisen by random collision of molecules. That makes no sense. Now, it turns out DNA contains a lot of information. In the case of the human genome, it's around 3 billion base pairs, but that's not really a good model for the simplest living thing. A better model for the simplest living thing would be, let's say, an E. coli, which is a very simple bacteria. Roughly 100 million of those letters, of those nucleotides. Let's cut that in half. Let's say 50 million base pairs. Let's cut it in half to 25 million base pairs as a model for the simplest conceivable living thing. That's the amount of information that's required in order to produce life. And my question is, where did that 25,000 letters worth of information come from? I'll tell you this, life, the universe does not produce information spontaneously. The probability of this happening by spontaneous collisions of molecules would be like taking 25 million letters, throwing them in the air, and when they land on the ground, you could actually read it like you'd read a book. And you'd be in which language? Let's say English or French or whatever. This is craziness. The idea that 25 million pieces of information sufficient to allow the existence of a living thing could come together by random collision of molecules, it makes no sense. And yet the atheist actually believes that happened. Now, let's add one layer to how impossible this actually is. Turns out the only thing in the universe that creates proteins is DNA. But the only thing in the universe that creates DNA is proteins. So you know about the chicken and the egg, right? They say, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I say to the atheist, which came first, the DNA or the protein? And this is a problem that the atheist has to solve. Because here's what the atheist believes. What they believe is, by some random set of accidents, the 25 million pieces of information, that is the DNA and the simplest of everything, would have to assemble. And in the same place, in the same sort of randomly, accidentally collected blob of chemicals, the proteins that would have been made by the DNA was also made. But those proteins weren't made by the DNA. So the DNA that would have made the protein and the protein that would have made the DNA both need to self-assemble in the same place, and then you have life. This makes no sense. And the idea, remember, a series of singularly beneficial accidents, right? That's what Thomas Huxley said. I would say that this idea, from what we know about life, is nonsensical. It is not rational. By the way, there's a nice picture. Nature spontaneously creates order, as we can see in those crystals. But what nature does not do spontaneously is create information. So let's say you have a house of cards. The idea that life could be spontaneously created by throwing energy at chemicals is like the idea that you could take a vacuum cleaner pointed backward, point it at a massive pile of cards, and would build a house of cards. Because the same energy that built that house of cards would destroy it the moment it was created. This does not make sense. All right, so we talked a little bit about chemistry, why chemistry tells me there has to be a designer and a creator. I talked a little bit about biochemistry, why biochemistry tells me there has to be a designer, there has to be a creator. Let's talk about physics. Now, up until the 1940s, physicists, especially cosmologists, they had consensus that the universe was eternal. In other words, they believed the universe had always existed. Why do they believe that? Well, the alternative is that the universe was created. But if the universe was created, that creates a problem for atheists. It didn't create a problem for the believers, but it created a problem for the atheists. Because if the universe was created, that implies a creator. So physicists were unanimous in their belief that the universe was eternal. But then in the 1930s, the redshift was discovered, which shows the universe is expanding at a very great rate. And then in the 1960s, they discovered the microwave background radiation. The final conclusion is, of physicists, is the universe was created in an event that they sometimes call the Big Bang. And this theory says at some point, the entire universe existed from nothing. All right, there was nothing, and then all the energy, all the matter, all the light, even space itself came to exist out of nothing. In fact, even time did not exist before this event happened. Now, the Bible had said this all along. Hebrews 11:3, by faith we understand the universe was created so that what is seen was not made from things that are seen, but from things that are invisible. In other words, the Bible had proposed for thousands of years that the visible universe was created from an invisible thing, the thing that we call God. But finally, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, physicists caught up, and now they believe in this thing we call the Big Bang. In other words, physicists now believe that the universe was created in a massive creation of light. In other words, God said, let there be light. And in this massive creation of light was created all the matter and the energy came from nothing. So thank you, physicists, for catching up with the Bible on that one. But then, as the physical, by the way, whether the Big Bang actually happened or not, it's hard to prove because it's an event in the deep past. But what I would say is every single thing we know about the universe tells us that the universe was created in a flash of light from nothing. But as physicists began to study this event that they call the Big Bang, they noticed that the universe is tuned, it's finely tuned to an incredible degree. It appears to not be randomly created at all. All right, for example, let's talk about gravity. You see the number on the screen there? That's 59 zeros followed by a 1. It turns out that what physicists and cosmologists discovered is this, because gravity is the force which pulls matter together. So when the universe expanded, it was created, it was expanding very rapidly, and only because of gravity does it clump together to form stars and galaxies and planets. Well, it turns out if the force of gravity was larger than it is by that fraction on the screen, the universe would have collapsed almost as soon as it was created. But it turns out if the force of gravity had been smaller than it is by that same fraction, then the universe would have expanded forever and stars and galaxies and planets would never have formed. So my question for the physicists, I have two questions. Number one, why is there gravity? To the atheist, why is there gravity? The atheist literally has no answer to that question, none. Next question, why does gravity have the value it has? Why is it so precisely exist, so without which there'd be no life? I don't know if you have if you have anything like a lottery in Ghana, maybe you don't, but in America we have a lottery, the super lottery. All right, and the probability of winning is like 1 in, I don't know, a billion or something like that. So let's imagine you had a friend who won the big lottery. What would you say? You'd say, awesome, that's great, good job. Now, wait a minute, you're a Christian, why are you paying the lottery? But never mind that. Let's imagine the same person won the big lottery again the next week. You go, that's not possible. It turns out the chances, let's say that the force of gravity is created by random design, undesigned, just random. The probability of the force of gravity having the correct value would be like winning the big lottery 6 weeks in a row. And if somebody won the big lottery 6 weeks in a row, I tell you right now, they'd be in prison. That's impossible. So that number represents the probability of the force of gravity having the right value by random chance. And I think it's roughly the probability that the atheist is right and there is no God. All right. It turns out, though, that's not all. There are over 30 parameters all of which define the basics of how the universe works, which are very finely tuned. If you change any one of them from the value it actually has by sometimes by very, very tiny proportions, the universe could not support life. All right, for example, let's see, the third one on the list. You see the first one is the gravitational force, the nuclear force, the strong nuclear force. The strong nuclear force is what holds nuclei together. Protons repel each other because of their charge, right? And the neutrons are the glue that holds the nucleus together. Well, it turns out if the nuclear force was just slightly larger than it is, then there'd be no hydrogen, only larger atoms. If there's no hydrogen, there'd be no stars, and there'd be no life. Now, it turns out if the nuclear force was only slightly weaker, then there'd be only hydrogen. And then again, we wouldn't have life. And there are many other examples of these. The amount of electric charge in the universe, all these other things, the amount of matter and antimatter, etc. So Fred Hoyle, a famous physicist who's also a believer, he said, a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry. And by the way, I haven't even talked about biology. The idea that the universe we live in was created by just random accident is an absurd idea. That's part of why I became a Christian in the first place, why I became a believer in the first place. Because when I was in college, I claimed to be an atheist. And it was science. Science was one of the reasons I became a believer. And it started me on my journey towards becoming a Christian. Here's Anthony Flew, the most famous intellectual atheist in the last part of the 20th century. Finally, in 2004, he decided, you know what, there has to be a God because of design. All right, many other examples of things in the universe that are required in order for life to exist, the right kind of galaxy, the right kind of star, the right kind of planet, all these other things. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go straight to Romans 1:20. Which says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Romans 1:20. Let me add to that. I would say scientists especially are without excuse for believing in God. How can a scientist who understands the nature of biology and physics and chemistry and cosmology, can they possibly not believe in a very powerful designer God? I don't understand how they do it. And in Romans 1, it says they deliberately ignore the facts. Basically, that's what it is. All right, so now what I've done is I've established, I believe, the idea from science that there has to be a creator, an intelligent creator. What do we know about this creator so far? Well, one thing we know is very smart and very powerful to create a universe. But then the next question is, well, all right, which creator? Maybe it's the Hindu God. Maybe it's the Muslim God. Maybe it's the God of Buddhism or some other philosophy. Which God? What I'm going to say is this. As a Christian, and as I read the Bible, I say, which God? I say the God of the Bible. I'm going to talk about why that is. I'm going to share a story with you. This story, I think I told it to some of the members of the staff earlier when we were here, but I was a scientist. I am a scientist, and I was traveling in a van with a bunch of other science professors. And one of the professors said, oh, Christianity, what a stupid religion. Oh, any scientist could ever be a Christian. She's there. Did you know that in the Bible, it says, if you wear clothing with a mixture of more than one material, capital punishment? And I spoke up. She was assuming, of course, that all of us were atheists, which is not true at all. Actually, many scientists are believers. It's just the atheists talk so loud. So I said, excuse me, the Bible doesn't say that. And she said, yes, it does. I saw it at a website. Then I said, you know what? I've read the Bible, I don't know, at least 4 or 5 times from cover to cover. People say it's full of all science errors. I haven't found one yet. I don't know what they're talking about. Then I pulled out my Bible and I said a quick prayer because I needed to find the verse that talks about clothing with more than one material. I knew it was in Leviticus, and I knew it was on the right-hand side of the page, and I found that passage and I read it. And by the way, the Bible does say not to wear material with more than one material, clothing with more than one, like cotton and, say, wool or something like that. But it definitely does not mention anything about capital punishment. That is not true. And by the way, the reason the Bible, the Mosaic covenant talks about that is teaching a lesson about purity, about not mixing the profane and the holy. That, I believe that's why God put that in there. All right, here's a quote from Dallas McCown. He's a very famous biologist who's also an atheist. And here's what he says. It's a typical attitude that people have about Christianity. These really smart intellectual people. They say Christianity is scientifically unsupported and probably insupportable, philosophically suspect at best and disreputable at worst, and historically fraudulent. Now, let me stop right there. Really? So the Bible is historically fraudulent. I say to the person who makes that claim, can you tell me a single fact in the Bible that is contradicted by any archaeological or historical? Why do people say this stuff? Do they even know what they're talking about? He says philosophically suspect at best and disreputable at worst. I would put biblical philosophy, known as Christian theology, up against any human philosophy any day. Hands down, it wins. I've written a whole book about that. Should be published in a few months. But then he says that Christianity is scientifically unsupported and probably unsupportable. In other words, scientists say, oh, there's all these obvious science errors in the Bible. Well, that's interesting because the Bible said long before physics that the universe was created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at just a small piece of information from the Old Testament that relates to science. All right, and we're going to talk about science and health. Now, this document, you can see the label there, is Papyrus Ebers. This comes from ancient Egypt from roughly 1,500 BC. What it is, it's a collection of medical knowledge in Egypt. It's like the physician's desk reference in Egypt of roughly 1,500 BC. The timing is important because that's roughly when Moses lived. So this is a collection of medical knowledge from the Egyptians, who some would say would have the most advanced medical knowledge in the ancient world. Now let's look at some of the prescriptions in Papyrus Ebers. Here's one. To prevent hair from turning gray, anoint it with the blood of a calf, which has been boiled in oil, or with the fat of a rattlesnake. All right, let's try that prescription to see if it'll prevent gray hair. Here's another one. A mixture of 6 fats, namely those of the horse, hippopotamus, crocodile, cat, snake, and the ibex to prevent hair loss. All right, now clearly I've not been using that stuff. All right, I've lost most of my hair. Now, first of all, that would not work. Second of all, the reason the men would presumably do this is so that they'd be attractive to the women. And women, do you want to hang out with a guy who's got that stuff on their head? I don't think so. Now, if we look at Papyrus Ebers, there are a number of medicines. One of the medicines in Papyrus Ebers was lizard's blood to cure disease, or the pig's teeth, or rotten meat was used as medicine in Papyrus Ebers. And even excrement, even human excrement, was used as medicine in Papyrus Ebers. Now, that we could take that as being funny, but I say that's not funny at all. The average lifespan in Egypt was probably less than 20 years. Not because people couldn't live beyond 20 years, but because almost everybody died from some kind of infectious disease. And the Papyrus Ebers offered absolutely nothing to prevent infectious disease. Now, there's an interesting passage. It's in Exodus 15:2. If you read that, God promises his people through Moses that if they follow the laws that he gave them in the Levitical covenant, the covenant Sinai, they would not have the diseases of their neighbors. All right, let's think about that a little bit. Let's look at some of the laws in Leviticus, and let's see why it is that many of the diseases of their neighbors were prevented. For example, you're probably aware that in the law of Moses, certain meats they could eat and certain meats they couldn't eat, correct? For example, beef, yes. Pork, no. Fish with scales, yes. Different kinds of shellfish, no. And it just so happens every meat on the okay to eat list is relatively safe, and every meat on the can't eat list is relatively dangerous. For example, pork. Pork carries 22 known diseases. One of them is trichinosis. Trichinosis is a fatal disease that pork can carry. Now, if we use modern safety practices, if we slaughter our pigs in a safer environment, pork is relatively safe. But even then, cook the pork until it's, cooked all the way through. Beef, on the other hand, is relatively safe, even raw. In fact, I was in a restaurant in Venezuela several years ago, and I ordered from the menu. I speak Spanish, but I didn't know what the stuff on the menu was. So I said, bring me that thing. It was a plate of raw beef. And I thought about Leviticus. And I said, all right, I'm going to eat it because raw beef is relatively safe. Even raw, it's relatively safe. All right, and also fish. For example, clams and oysters and crustaceans carry all kinds of diseases. But raw fish with scales is relatively safe. Sushi, correct? Sushi is relatively safe. Do not eat raw clams and raw oysters. There's a lot of diseases there. I suggest you not do that. Now, if that was the only thing, now remember, all the ancient peoples ate all these meats, and thousands, millions of them died from the diseases they carried. The Jews were protected because they only ate relatively safe kinds of meat. Now, if that was the only example, I think the skeptic could say, well, that doesn't really prove much. But that's not the only example. For example, in Numbers, it says, whoever touches the dead body of anybody will be unclean for 7 days. And it gave a specific prescription. I'll talk about that prescription of ashes and hyssop. All right. And this seems like a harsh law. I mean, what that means is whoever prepares the body for burial can't even attend the funeral. Harsh. Why would God say that? All right. Well, let's talk about that. Here's a guy. His name is Ignaz Semmelweis. He was working in a hospital in Vienna. And what he proposed is, by the way, in his hospital, it was a woman's hospital. The death rate in that hospital was 20%. In other words, 20% of the women who entered that hospital died in that hospital. That's a terrible death rate. This is why in earlier times, people did not have their children in the hospital. Not because they couldn't afford to go to the hospital, it's because they couldn't afford to not go to the hospital and have the doctor come to their home, which was much safer. Now, what Semmelweis noticed was in his hospital, the doctors would come in the morning, they would examine the bodies of the women who died the night before that were in the lower level of the hospital, and then they would proceed to the wards with the living patients and examine them. We go, no, crazy. How could they do that? It's because we understand what's called germ theory. But when Semmelweis was working in this hospital, germ theory was just coming in. So he said, whenever you touch a dead body, you need to wash your hands very thoroughly with soap and water before you touch a living patient. The death rate went from 20% down to 4%. But that's not all. He didn't stop there. He said, let's do this. Even when you touch a living patient, you need to clean your hands very carefully with soap and water before you touch another living patient. And then the death rate went down to less than half of 1%. Now, it's interesting because in the Old Testament, it says when a woman has her period, she's unclean. Or when a woman gives birth to a baby, she's unclean. Why would God say that? Why would God say that women are unclean when they have their period and when they give birth? The reason is because everybody knows that God hates women. Just kidding. That's not true. God loves women. And think about it. When are women especially susceptible to infectious diseases? You know when that is, when they give birth. And yes, even during their period. All right. So anyway, let's talk about the Bible's prescription. By the way, I was teaching this lesson in Hungary, and I told them that Semmelweis was from Serbia. They said, no, he's not. He's from Hungary. I said, I'm pretty sure he's from Serbia. They said, no, he's from Hungary. And they took me to his house. They have a museum there. And so I no longer say that. He's actually born in Budapest. But anyway, like I said, in these maternity wards, roughly 20% of the patients were dying. And the doctors had no explanation. They said it's due to constipation or hysteria. The women are just hysterical. Typical male attitudes say the women are just hysterical. 18% to 0.5%. Now let's look at the prescription. It turns out the prescription God said is when you touch a dead body, you clean it, you clean yourself and everything you've touched with hyssop, with ashes and water. Now, it turns out hyssop is a very, very oily herb. And when you take the hyssop and the ash and the water, you create soap. But hyssop is a unique plant because hyssop, the oil of hyssop has 5% of this compound in the tree. It's called thymol. You know, when you go into a hospital, you know that smell, that disinfectant smell? You know that smell? It's thymol. When I teach organic chemistry, we call these molecules phenols. Thymol is one example of a molecule called a phenol. And what I teach my organic chemistry students is phenols have this interesting property is that they're not poisonous to human beings, but they kill bacteria. Aha! So God said, when you touch a dead body, you clean yourself, your entire body, and everything you touch with a powerful antibacterial soap. Very interesting. All right, another example. Leviticus 13:46 has a law about certain skin diseases. If you have certain skin diseases, such as leprosy, it says you have complete quarantine, no physical contact whatsoever with any other human beings. How harsh that law was. Quarantine for infectious skin diseases. What's interesting, though, is leprosy was the most feared disease in the ancient world. It didn't kill more people. Typhus killed more people. Malaria killed more people. Cholera killed more people. Yellow fever killed more people. But the reason that leprosy was so feared was because of the horrible way it killed people. It literally rotted your body over years and years. It was a horrible way to die. Science had no answer. They claimed it had to do with conjunction of the planets or eating hot food or whatever. All right. Now, what the Bible said is quarantine. Well, it turns out in Scandinavia in the 16th century, some monks were reading the Bible and saw what it said about infectious skin diseases. They proposed what we should do with it is this. Whenever people have leprosy, we need to quarantine them and completely separate them from all other people. Within 2 or 3 generations, leprosy had essentially disappeared in Europe simply by applying the biblical prescription. All right. Here's one, two more examples. The second to last example will be Leviticus 17:14, which says, the life of every creature is in its blood. All right, now, do you know what the most common medical treatment used, at least in Europe, in the 18th and 19th century was? It was bloodletting. Basically, the accepted theory of medical science in the 18th and 19th century was if you have an infectious disease, the disease is in the blood, which kind of makes sense logically. So they propose what you do is you do bloodletting. So you cut open the artery, drain out a bunch of the blood, stop it, and you do several bloodlettings. So medical science says the disease is in the blood. The Bible said the life is in the blood. Well, guess what science has discovered? By the way, these were instruments used for bloodletting. All right. Well, it turns out if you have an infectious disease, literally, the life is in the blood. Our immune system, which the scientists didn't know about back then, our immune system is contained in our blood, the leukocytes, the white blood cells, the T cells, all those kinds of cells. So if you have an infectious disease, the worst idea is to do bloodletting. All right, last example has to do with circumcision. And actually, circumcision goes back even before the law of Moses. Circumcision goes all the way back to Genesis 17. God said to his people, for all generations to come, every single male Jew is to be circumcised on the 8th day. And again, I have a question. Why circumcision and why the 8th day? One thing to notice is God gave them all these laws, right? He didn't tell them why. He just said, do it. And I'm proposing reasons why. I'm proposing the reason for the meat, laws about meat and touching dead bodies. I'm proposing that there was a medical reason for this. But it's interesting because each one of these laws had a spiritual meaning as well. Not touching the dead body, that had a spiritual meaning. All right. Anyway, so why circumcision and why circumcision on the 8th day? Let's talk about why circumcision. Let's think about it. Back then, very few people died of what we call, in quotes, natural causes of old age. Almost everybody died from some kind of an infectious disease. Usually that would be bacteria or fungus. And where do bacteria and fungus grow the best? Wherever it's dark and wet and warm. And where is the darkest, wettest, warmest place on a guy? I think you know what I'm talking about. And so it turns out that male circumcision prevented many diseases, okay? In fact, most of the diseases that were prevented was for women. Especially women were susceptible to diseases that were carried that were prevented from circumcision. In fact, AIDS. Obviously, AIDS has been a huge problem in Africa. The rate of AIDS spreading is reduced. There have been a number of studies, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4. The rate of spread of AIDS from male to male. From male to female, From male to female, the rate of AIDS spreading is reduced by something like 2/3 to 3/4 simply by male circumcision, which is why a number of world aid organizations have proposed male circumcision, adult male circumcision. I don't think many guys are going to go for that. But you know what? The Bible has an even better way to prevent the spread of AIDS. How about one man, one woman for life? If every person in Africa were to practice one man, one woman for life, AIDS would disappear within just a few years. All right. Why has there been such a big problem with AIDS in Africa? Well, it's because of the sexual promiscuity in those countries. That's why. Very simple. All right. So male circumcision. By the way, today, I'm assuming that the guys here that you take a shower, right? I assume you take a shower pretty often. And therefore, the health benefit from male circumcision today is less now than it was then. Okay. So it's not as obvious. It still has health benefits, for example, in preventing the spread of AIDS. But why circumcision on the 8th day? Why not circumcise on the 1st day? Why not circumcise, I don't know, maybe on the 12th day? Because the number 12, that had great importance, great meaning to the Jews. The number 7, the number 3, but why 8? I mean, why the 8th day? Again, the Bible doesn't say, and I can't speak for God. You could ask God why the 8th day, but I think I know why the 8th day. It turns out vitamin K, which is absolutely essential for blood clotting, does not pass through the placenta. So the child, when they're born, has no vitamin K, none. So where's the vitamin K come from? It comes from bacteria in the gut. The baby is born, the baby eats from mommy, the bacteria gets in the large intestine, and very soon after that, the baby has vitamin K. It turns out, though, it's not the vitamin K that causes the blood clot. The vitamin K allows the body to produce a protein called prothrombin. And prothrombin is the protein that's responsible for creating the blood clot. I'm going to show you a graph. The graph is going to be concentration of prothrombin in the blood versus number of days after they're born. It turns out when a baby is born, they do have some prothrombin because that does pass through the placenta, some, but not much. Then the child starts to produce vitamins. Then it drops down to an equilibrium level. So here's the graph. This is available prothrombin in the human body versus time. Look at that graph. And what is the safest day from the moment a child is born, a male child is born, to the day they die? What's the safest day to perform a male circumcision? Turns out it's the 8th day, or maybe the 7th or the 9th day. They'd probably be equally good. So again, I see medical wisdom in the Bible. People say the Bible has all these science errors. I say, can you show me a single one? I see great scientific wisdom in the Bible. Now, so I believe that science supports the idea that the Bible is inspired by God. Now, let's say this represents all the evidence for the inspiration of the Bible. Now, the scientific evidence for the inspiration of the Bible is like a tiny fraction. I don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible primarily because of the scientific evidence. I believe in the inspiration of the Bible because of the evidence from messianic prophecies, from fulfilled types, prefigures, and foreshadows, from the historical accuracy of the Bible. There are many, many other reasons I believe the Bible is inspired by God. The scientific evidence is a small fraction of that. But nevertheless, I say, which God? The God of the Bible. And science says that as well. I believe, like it says in 2 Timothy 3:16, that all scripture is inspired by God. And one of the reasons I believe all scripture is inspired by God is because of the scientific evidence in the Bible. All right, so that's the lecture, but we planned, I think, something like an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to open it up for question and answer. Okay, college students tend to have lots of questions. I assume there's some teens here as well, and I want to hear some questions. All right, so if you want, you could either write something in the chat if you want. We could find the question you have in the chat, or you could raise your hand, do one of those hand raising things they can do in Zoom. Then I'll call you on you. You can ask your question live. All right. So let's start the question and answer part of our session today. I'm going to look on the chat, see if there's any questions there. But if I don't see your hand raising thing, just turn off your mute and ask the question. Okay. Okay. Do we have any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat. So does anybody have questions? If so, raise your hand. Hard to believe nobody has a question. Okay, great. Philip, go ahead and unmute.
Hello, John.
Hi.
So, you obviously you've heard of the James Webb Telescope.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think I read something in the media recently about the possible existence of another galaxy, sort of resembling the Milky Way galaxy. So, so let me just ask you something. Do you think that the possibility that another Earth might exist there changes anything about what we already know about God?
Okay, first of all, it's a good question. So the question is there life somewhere else in the universe? Right? And I would say there's hundreds of billions of galaxies, and each galaxy having, say, roughly 100 billion stars. So there's a lot of stars out there. And the answer is probably somewhere out there, there would be a planet that would be capable of supporting life. All right? The Bible does not address the issue of whether there's life anywhere else in the universe. In fact, really, what would God have said? It said in another galaxy, they didn't even have a word for galaxy. Other planets, they didn't even know what a planet was. So the Bible does not discuss life in other places. So we're left to use science to think about that. Now, I would say this: life could not be created by spontaneous natural processes. So if there's life somewhere else in the universe, either it's spread from one place to another, which is possible. It's not inconceivable. Spores of life can exist in very cold temperatures for thousands of years. So it's not impossible if life started, say, on Mars, that it could have somehow been transported to the Earth. So if there's life anywhere else, either it's spread there or God created life there. But life is not created through spontaneous processes. So the only way there'd be life anywhere in the universe is because God created life there, or because it's spread there from somewhere else. The Bible simply doesn't address this issue. Is there intelligent life elsewhere? My answer is I have absolutely no idea. Has God created intelligent, accountable beings on another planet? I have absolutely no idea. Would Jesus have to go and die there as well to save them? I have no idea. This is just a matter for speculation. So, like I said, cosmologists and those who study how solar systems evolve over time say that it's quite likely that there are other planets which would in principle be able to support life. But I say, as a scientist, the only way there could be life there is because God created it. And so whether God did or not, I have no idea. I see Dion Boyakie. I have a friend whose last name is Boyakie from the UK. I wonder if you're related. Anyway, is that a reasonable answer to your question, Philip?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Maybe about the age of the Earth, or maybe about evolution, or what about the dinosaurs? What about those things? Any other questions? Okay, go ahead and Odun. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yes, good evening. Just to ask, I know the topic about God and science is quite very, very big. And lately of these days, we see a lot of scientists trying to either adopt or treat God's invention, even to the extent that people say that they're trying to use AI to make sure that people can stay longer, just to make their heart keeps beating so that they don't die or something. So how do you do that? I mean, that is now bringing a lot of conflicts in terms of the thought. I don't know if I'm making sense to an extent.
That's not as much a moral question as it is an ethical question. And I've given presentations on ethics, scientific ethics in Christianity. So the question is, if science makes it possible for us to do something, should we as Christians support doing that thing? All right. So, and I think that's a complex question. I mean, science allows us to have antibiotics, and antibiotics prevent death. And I think anything medical science allows us to do that helps the human condition so that they have less suffering and so that they can live a natural lifespan, I think that's something that Christians should celebrate rather than criticize. All right. The question is, what about extending the natural lifespan? Well, some of the ways to extend the natural lifespan are to eat healthier foods, to eat lower fat foods, to keep your health, your weight under control, and do more exercise. Anything like that, I'd say go for it, because God says that we should honor our body, should take care of our body. Everything we've been given by God, we should take care of. But what if science eventually allows us to, should a Christian support that? And because it seems like God said that the limit of a human's lifespan is 120 years. Well, I'd say the kinds of technologies that are likely to develop are ones which might allow humans to live a little bit longer, but our DNA is built in so that the cells only replicate a certain number of times. So I predict it's going to be very, very difficult to extend the human lifespan to 500 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. And should we as Christians allow our DNA to be changed so we become not really even a natural human to extend the lifespan? I am very, first of all, that doesn't exist, so it's kind of it's not a relevant question right now. But I am skeptical of Christians doing unnatural things that would unnaturally affect the human lifespan. In other words, medical scientific advances that allow humans to have less suffering and to live within the normal God-created lifespan is something I support fully. But unnaturally expanded lifespan to hundreds of years, I'm not sure that I'd be comfortable with that as a Christian. The Bible is not going to give us a direct answer to that question. You're not going to find a passage in the Bible that specifically says whether it's okay to extend the human lifespan, because the very idea of extending the human lifespan was not even within the conceivable realm of human possibility at that time. To me, that's more of an ethical than a moral issue. There's been proposed eugenics, the idea that we could somehow adjust the human DNA to prevent, say, inheritable diseases. To me, that seems okay, because that's allowing humans to live less suffering and to live a normal lifespan. But to extend the human lifespan to hundreds of years, which I'm not sure if scientists will ever be able to do that. It's quite speculative. All right, they've done a number of experiments, say, with mice that allow mice to live twice as long, but not 10 times as long. Mice are genetically pre-programmed to only have a limited lifespan. So I'm sorry to give you a somewhat nuanced answer. I'm sorry to give you a not fully clear black and white answer, more of a gray answer. But that's what I can do. That's a question of medical ethics. Okay. All right.
Okay. I think we have quite a number of questions as well in the chat box.
All right. Let me go to the chat box. Yeah.
Sure.
All right, so let me see here. Let me look at all the questions. Let's do them kind of in order. All right. Thanks very much for the amazing class. My question is about the dates and days stated in Genesis. Would that be our 21st century calendar? I don't know what you mean by the 21st century calendar. So are we talking about the age of the earth? Who is this? This is Hillary Mozinguzi. Hillary, go ahead and maybe unmute. Are you asking about the age of the earth? Is that what you're asking? You're asking about the days of Genesis? Is that what you're asking about? Hillary?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. John. Thank you very much. So my question was basically about the days, as in 7 days.
In Genesis.
In Genesis, yeah. God
Right.
created the world.
But what are you
first
asking
day,
about the
second day,
21st century calendar? I don't understand what you mean by the 21st century calendar.
Yeah, would that mean that those days are similar to the days we have now, 24 hours in a day?
All right, I understand. Okay, good. Yeah, let's talk about Genesis chapter 1. Okay. Genesis chapter 1 describes 6 days of creation. Yes, technically not 7. And the question is whether those are literal days or metaphorical days. All right. Now, Genesis 1 is primarily an argument where God explains who he is to his people. And in Genesis 1, God claims to be creator, one who creates order out of chaos, and one who separates light from darkness, land from water, water from air, animal from plant, life in the air from light from the land. So God creates distinctions. And so I believe Genesis 1 is primarily a discussion of worldview from God's perspective. It's not primarily a scientific document. So the question is, are those days literal 24-hour days? Or are they not? And the answer is, well, it's not clear. In fact, even in the early church fathers, some of them took those days literally, others took them metaphorically. For example, Tertullian took them literally, but Origen took them metaphorically. So that comes down to sort of biblical exegesis. The word yom, is that describing literal 24-hour periods, or is that describing basically the stages over which God worked? So first God did this, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. And those days are just sort of a metaphorical framework to describe what God did. Now, I'll give you my opinion about that. My opinion about that is God saying, first I did this in the first part of creation, and then I did this, and then I did this. So the picture of Genesis is first God created the universe, he created light, he created the planet, then he created an atmosphere, he separated the atmosphere from the water, and eventually the land emerged out of the water, and then life emerged first in the water, then on the land, and then greater, more complicated life forms, and last of all, human beings. So I believe that this account is describing in somewhat metaphorical terms the facts about what God did. So now let's talk about the evidence from science. The evidence from science is that the earth is quite old. And it's not as if there's any doubt about that. For example, let's imagine we look at a star. We're looking at a star, and that star, the light comes through a telescope. We see that star, and that star is 1 billion light years away. Let's say it's a galaxy, 1 billion light years away. So when did that light from that galaxy leave that galaxy? Well, if it's 1 billion light years away, that means the light left that galaxy 1 billion years ago. All right, so how old is that galaxy? It's at least 1 billion years old. We have uranium, thorium dating, and we can discover rocks that are roughly 3.8 billion years old. In fact, the rocks that came from the moon, when they measured those rocks using uranium, thorium, lead dating, they appear to be roughly 4.5 billion years old. So the evidence is that our solar system is about 4.5 billion years old. All right. And then, we look at evidence, for example, fossil evidence. The evidence is that dinosaurs lived a very long time ago. They only exist in sediments that have been buried under many other sediments above them. Now, I believe that God could create the earth in 6 days. I believe he could do that. Jesus said that, actually John the Baptist said that God could create children of Abraham from the stones that are in the ground. I believe that. I believe that if God wanted to, he could create the earth and the universe like that in 6 days. The question isn't whether he could, the question is whether he did. And I would say the scientific evidence says that he did not do that he created it over a great period of time. Now, again, God could have created the earth just a few thousand years ago, but if he did, when he created it, he made it appear to be old. Now, could God create earth with an appearance of age? The answer is, of course he could do that. Jesus created fish, and it was ready to eat. It appeared to be, 2 or 3 years old, and it was already cooked. Jesus made wine that appeared to have been aged already. In fact, it was very good wine. All right, so God could do that, but the question is whether he did or not. All right, so if God did create the earth only a few thousand years ago, then what about that galaxy that's a billion light years away? Does that galaxy even exist or not? I mean, why would God do that? So I guess he would create the galaxy, but he'd also create God could do that if he wanted to, but that's a little odd. And by the way, if the earth is only a few thousand years old, then dinosaurs never lived. So why would God put dinosaur fossils in the ground? What's that about? Again, God could do whatever he wants. I don't really care. I don't really care if people believe the earth is old or young, but let's not say that a young earth is a scientific idea. It's a more of a theological idea based on the idea that God could do whatever he wants. So my opinion is that those days represent the periods of time over which God worked. All right. But I'm perfectly comfortable with believers who think God just went boom and he just created the earth in 6 days with an appearance of age. What they shouldn't say, in my opinion, is that science agrees with that, because science simply doesn't agree with that. All right. Now, the same person asked a second question. All right, but I'm gonna go to the next one. I'll come back. There's a question here about end times in Matthew 28:20. All right, I'm going to skip that one for now. I'll come back to that. All right. Now, next question is, please, can you share about the age of the earth according to the Bible and its age according to science? So like I said, according to science, according to our scientific methods of finding the age of rocks, especially uranium-lead dating, there's also potassium argon dating, etc. The earth appears to be roughly 4.5 billion years old. All the scientific evidence says the earth is quite old. All right. And so there you go. By the way, I teach a class called Intro to Scientific Thought, where I try to teach them about how science works and how scientific theories work. And so I tell them that the scientific evidence says the earth is 4.5 billion years old. Then I say to my students, does that mean it's 4.5 billion years old? My students say, no, it doesn't mean that. It just means the evidence says that. Because all scientific evidence, all scientific conclusions are tentative. They know that. They understand that. All right. So, and by the way, the universe, the universe, according to scientists, based on looking at the oldest objects and the distance and all that kind of stuff, scientists have estimated that the universe itself is somewhere around 13.5 billion years old. That's what the scientific evidence says. I don't know of any evidence to the contrary. All right. So I am perfectly comfortable with Christians who take the literal interpretation of Genesis 1. I don't think it's an important doctrine. And I just ask people who take the young earth view to not claim that there's scientific evidence for that, simply because there's not. All right. Now, the next question is, I want to ask what the Bible meant when it said God remembered Noah and his family after the flood. while the Bible also said everything was wiped out apart from that in the ark. Yeah. So now I want to make a comment, just a general comment. The comment is, I think it's important for us as Christians to know why we believe what we believe. Let me explain myself. There are several things that are in the Bible, and I believe they're true because the evidence says they're true. There are other things that are in the Bible that I believe they're true just because the Bible says it's true. Let me give some examples. For example, I believe the Bible says the universe was created from nothing. All right? The Bible says that. I believe it's true because the evidence says so. I believe God created light because the evidence says so. I believe Jesus was resurrected from the dead because the evidence says so. I believe the Bible is inspired by God because the evidence says so. I believe in Adam and Eve because the Bible says so. That's why I believe in Adam and Eve. I believe in heaven. I have no evidence from science or anywhere else of heaven. The only reason I believe in heaven is because the Bible says it's real. And so I believe in Adam and Eve principally because the story of Adam and Eve is found in the Bible, and I've been already thoroughly convinced that the Bible is inspired by God. So there are many things that I believe simply because they're in the Bible. And one of those is the flood of Noah. Now, in the case of the flood of Noah, it's actually mixed because the fact is every truly ancient culture has a flood story, a flood myth. The flood myth is found amongst the Hottentots in South Africa. It's found in the Indians in North America, ancient China, ancient India, ancient Greece. All ancient cultures that are truly ancient cultures have a flood story. That tells me that there probably was a massive worldwide flood in the deep past. It's the only possible explanation of why there are flood stories from North America, from South America, from Australia, from Asia, from Africa, from Europe. I believe there was a worldwide flood, all right? But I'll be honest with you, the story about Noah and the ark, the reason I believe that is because it's in the Bible, and I will not apologize for that. All right, so I believe that Noah is an actual person who actually lived, that he and his family built a large vessel, which they got in because God told Noah to, and that they brought animals with them on the ark. I believe the animals they brought with them on the ark, though, were ones from that part of the world. I don't think llamas trotted from South America through North America, across the Bering Sea, through Russia, and ended up in Mesopotamia and got on the ark. I don't think so. I don't think that koalas or kangaroos hopped from Australia, got on the ark, and then hopped back to Australia. So how do I explain that? So here's what I think. This is just my opinion. Folks, it's just my opinion. My opinion was there was a massive worldwide flood that killed almost every living thing on the earth. The reason I believe that is because, number one, the Bible says so. And number two, the evidence from anthropology and from just ancient culture says this flood occurred. But my opinion is that there were small enclaves of life, that everything there in the immediate area of Mesopotamia where Noah lived, that everything there was wiped out. But I believe there were very small remnants of life that survived the flood and that they repopulated the earth. That's just my opinion. Like I said, I believe in the flood. I believe it's a worldwide flood. I believe the reason it happened is the reason that the Bible says, because of God's retribution against sin. I also believe in 2 Peter 3, where it says the flood, which really did occur, is evidence of the future event where God's going to come back and the earth will be consumed by fire. All right, so let's go on here. Okay, let's see. Can we connect the curse evoked on Eve by God through painful childbearing to confirm the authenticity of the Bible? I don't think so. because all animals suffer some pain, all mammals anyway, suffer some kind of pain in giving birth. I do think that I could be wrong, but I think human females have more pain in childbirth than other animals. I believe that's the case. But I think you could make the argument that it's because human beings have such large brains. And so it made it very, very difficult for women to give birth. So put it this way, I don't think you're going to convince an atheist to believe in the Bible because of what Genesis chapter 3 said to Eve about childbirth. I just, to a Christian, that might work, all right? But that's a Christian. They don't need that argument, okay? So if I'm trying to convince an atheist to believe in God or in the Bible, I would use different evidence than that. So I would say for you as a disciple, if you see that and go, that's sort of interesting, that there's a biblical explanation. If that helps your faith, great. That's awesome. That's fantastic. There are a lot of evidences that I believe. For example, I've seen God work in my life. I've seen God answer prayers. I don't use that to prove to an atheist God, because that's a personal experience. So I like to pick and choose the evidence I use to convince an atheist carefully. For example, I would happily give the presentation I just gave you to atheists. I've done it many times. Let me tell you a quick story. I was in Hong Kong a few years ago. Excuse me, Dr. Oakes, you never met me. But 27 years ago, I was an atheist living in San Diego, California, and I went to your presentation about God and science. You never met me, but that presentation convinced me to believe in God. I soon studied with the people there, and I was baptized. Thank you very much. So I think the evidence from the talk tonight could convince an atheist to believe in God. I don't know. But by the way, I don't call this a curse. I don't like using the word curse. I believe there were consequences to what Adam and Eve did, but God still protected Adam and Eve. All right, and he even protected Cain. Cain left, but he put the mark on Cain to protect him. I think God, there were consequences for Adam and Eve's sin. Yes, I don't like to call it a curse, though. I don't like using that language personally. So again, you could use the thing with Eve as evidence, but I personally don't think that will convince an unbeliever. I would use different arguments. All right. This is a brother or sister, I'm not sure, coming from Uganda. Welcome to the presentation. Did a Daniel workshop about 10 years ago. Very great. Amen. But that's not a question. Thank you, Hilary Musunguzi, for that encouragement. Let me see. What about the evidence of life that existed before humans, like dinosaurs, for example? Right. So like I said, the scientific evidence is this, that dinosaurs disappeared roughly 65 million years ago. And the evidence is solid on that. It's solid on that. So what I believe is the dinosaurs disappeared about 65 million years ago. That's what I believe. I mean, why would I not believe that? What in the Bible would prevent me from believing that, except possibly this sort of literal interpretation of the days of Genesis, which I personally don't believe in. All right, but if you're a young earther, in other words, you are a Christian who takes those 6 days literally, you need to understand that means the dinosaurs never lived, because there's no way you can scientifically justify the claim that dinosaurs lived 6,000 years ago. That is not true. That is definitely not true. And if you're going to say that it was, you're going to be in opposition with science. And I would say not to do that. Let's talk, for example, let's talk about evolution. Some Christians believe evolution is Satan's plan to destroy our faith. I completely disagree with that. Because guess who created evolution? God created evolution. God created living species with the ability to have mutations and to change over time, to adapt to change in the environment. And since God invented evolution, I say to God, good job, God. I would have never thought of that. Now, it does say in the Bible that God created all species, yes? It doesn't say how he did that. And I don't believe evolution is purely random. I believe that God at different times for different reasons has intervened in that process. I don't believe that purely random evolutionary processes would create all the life that we have. My personal belief is God has intervened at different times because anyway. What about a pre-Adamic race? That's a great question. I'm open to the idea of a pre-Adamic race. Now, for some of you on this talk, you say, what the heck is Kumasi talking about? So the question is, who are Adam and Eve? Now, the fact is there's some evidence for relatively intelligent ape-like creatures before humans. There's the Australopithecus, and there's all these different upright walking, much smaller brain, but upright walking, probably relatively intelligent pre-human life forms that seem to evolve. So there's pretty good evidence that orangutans, chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, and humans have a common ancestor in the evolutionary chain. All right, so to me, there's two possibilities. I already said I believe in Adam and Eve, right? You got that. Don't anybody go away from this thing saying, yeah, Dr. Oaks doesn't believe Adam and Eve are real. I believe Adam and Eve are the first man and the first woman. One idea that's been proposed is that God took a sort of evolved, intelligent, sort of pre-Adamic person and essentially gave them his image. In other words, he gave them the ability to create. He gave them free will. He gave them a sense of self-awareness. He gave them, all those things that make us different, all those things that make us be in the image of God. Another possibility is, although there were evolved, relatively intelligent creatures, that God created Adam and Eve. There you go. Boom, there's Adam. Boom, there's Eve. Now, that's my position. My position is God said, all right, boom, there's Adam. Not literally boom, I'm just using a sound effect here. There's Adam, there's Eve. If so, it's possible that there were other intelligent beings that did not have God's image in them, and that Adam and Eve's descendants displaced them over time. That's a possibility. I know if you're a young Christian and never thought about this might give you a headache. But the fact is, there's evidence from fossil evidence and anthropology that requires us to at least consider the possibility that there were pre-Adamic races that did not have God's image. That what makes us different from the animals is that he imparted his image to us. And what makes us unique as children of God is not that we have fingers and legs and brains and stuff like that. It's that we're made in his image, that we have the kind of emotions that God has. We have a sense of right and wrong. We have a conscience. We're self-aware. We have free will. Animals do not have free will. Animals do not have conscience. Animals don't have souls. Animals don't have spirits. All right. So we are created specially by God. I believe Adam and Eve are the first two of that special creation by God. But exactly what preceded Adam and Eve is a somewhat open question to me. So I don't reject the idea of a pre-Adamic race. I say I'm somewhat agnostic about that. All right. I hope that's not creating more confusion than help. All right. It says light, trees, and all these things that dinosaurs would eat were created after Adam. No, they weren't. The Bible doesn't say that. Where does the Bible say light and trees and these things were created after Adam? I don't see that. All right, I see that the very ultimate last of God's creation was Adam and Eve. That God created fish and flowering fruits and trees and birds, reptiles, creatures in the water, creatures in the air.
Sorry, John.
Yeah.
No, I meant to say that you're right. I meant to say that they were created post-Genesis. Because if dinosaurs and all these things existed before, I don't know if I'll make sense when I say before Genesis, then what were they eating?
What do you mean before Genesis?
Pre-Adamic.
I don't know what you mean by before Genesis.
Pre-Adamic.
Okay, but see, the biblical, I believe there's, even though I take those days metaphorically, I believe there's still historical content in the Genesis creation. So first God did this, then this, then this. And the last thing he did was create us in his image. And therefore, the Genesis 1 account includes those things that were done before. So Adam is not the first thing of creation. Adam is the last thing of creation, the very last thing. Everything else came before that. Does that make sense, Philip?
Maybe you can define for us. So maybe that's the thing actually. What's the pre-Adamic race?
I don't know. Like I said, I already said, I believe that God created Adam and Eve as a special creation. And so if there were, let's say the earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. Let's say that it has. All right. The scientific evidence says human-like creatures have been around for about 200,000 years. That's what we're talking about. These, in quotes, pre-Adamic races would only be in the last, couple 100,000 years. Okay. And dinosaurs, wow, way before that. 65 million years before there was any humans on the earth, at least according to science, that's when dinosaurs are around. And then the dinosaurs died out. And then, of course, there were already mammals, but the mammals started to rule the earth. And, you had your tree sloths and your saber-toothed tigers and your woolly mammoths and all those other things that were around. But the last of God's creation is human beings made in his image. That's what the Bible says. That's what I believe. And so some of the other details, the Bible doesn't talk about dinosaurs, right? Why would the Bible talk about dinosaurs? There were none. The Jews didn't even have a word for that. The Bible doesn't talk about bacteria or viruses or things like that because the Jews didn't even know they didn't know about microscopic life. So the Genesis story by its nature is very, very simple. And I also believe it's all true. Really, the only discussion is whether those days are literal or not. Okay, that's the way I see it. Okay. Sure. Francis is asking if you can share this with all disciples. Sure. All right. He's left to go to another meeting. All right. So we've had quite a few questions and answers. Let's open it up. Anybody can unmute who wants. Let's go for a free-for-all here. Anybody can unmute who wants. If you have a question, go ahead and ask it. Don't even have to raise your hand. Just unmute. Okay.
John.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. So this is what I wanted to ask. So thanks for the discussion. I think it's interesting. So when I read about dinosaurs and everything, they were eating, the stuff that they were eating would be like trees and stuff, right? some were eating trees and stuff, vegetation.
They're eating vegetation. I don't know if they ate trees.
Okay, so,
but they
so
ate vegetation, yeah.
Yes, but the
Right.
point that I'm making is that according to the Bible, vegetation was created, just before God created man. But anyway, I guess you've explained that in terms of period.
Again, Philip, there's two possibilities, exactly two possibilities. Either you take those days literally, or you don't.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is an essential doctrine. I have many close friends in the kingdom of God who take those days literally. Amen. Praise the Lord. Okay. But if we don't take them literally, that means we're talking about millions, in fact, billions of years over which these processes happened. And according to science, the kinds of plants that were living 150 million years ago were quite significantly different. All right. Flowering trees occurred fairly late. If I'm not mistaken, I'm not an expert, I'm not a paleontologist, but I believe flowering trees came after the dinosaurs, if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, so if we do not take the days of Genesis to be literal 24-hour periods, then what we're saying is this thing's happened a very long time ago. And I don't know, when if you read Genesis, when do you see plants? It's not on the 6th day, it's before that, that's for sure. Long before the 6th day. Okay, maybe we're getting into details the average person at this presentation is not super concerned about, but all right. Anybody else have a question? Maybe I've answered most of the questions related to this topic. All right, so who's in charge here? Does somebody want to just sum it all up and maybe do a final prayer and send us on the way?
Uncle John, somebody asked a question. He said, please, I would like to ask you, where did Cain get wife for himself after he left God's presence?
All right, that's a great question. All right, by the way, how many children did Eve have? Now, according to the Bible, she lived several hundred years, correct? How many children did she have? Now, we know of 3 different sons for sure, Cain, Abel, and Seth. But how many years was she able to produce children? Let's say she was able to produce children for 50 years. Let's say she had 25 children. So now it's 200 years later. And by then, she's a great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. And her descendants have also produced many children. If human beings could live for 500 years, and if the women could produce children for 50 years, the population of the earth would go up exponentially, very, very rapidly. So by the time Mary died, she could have been a not Mary. By the time Eve died, she could have been a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. All right? And so by the time Cain goes off after killing his brother, but by the time he's choosing a wife, the population of the earth could have been in the tens of thousands or something like that. Now, at least in principle then, Cain would have been marrying one of his sisters or maybe his cousin or something like that. And we find that we're pretty uncomfortable with that. But I believe Adam and Eve were more perfect. Genetically, they were more perfect. For example, here in Africa, you have a mutation that causes a sickle cell anemia. That mutation, by the way, also prevents death from malaria. So that's one reason it's spread here in Africa, because of malaria. And so we human beings have many mutations that have happened to us that cause us to have genetic diseases. My opinion is that Adam and Eve didn't have those diseases. And the reason God said that you can't marry your brother or your sister is because for genetic reasons, that's very bad. The inbreeding creates a lot of genetic disease. So it's far healthier to marry somebody who's at least two places removed. It's like second and third cousin, okay. First cousin, questionable. Brother or sister, really bad idea. So I believe the Bible outlaws that because it's bad for our health, not because it's inherently evil to marry your brother or sister. So, but back in these very early period, when men and women were living hundreds of years, I believe that's before mutations happened that caused humans to live less time. So if you think about it, let's say Cain is 100 years old, and let's say his mother is, I don't know, 300 years old. I don't know. The population of the earth could have been in the tens of thousands. So yeah, that's how I understand that. All right. So would somebody who's kind of overseeing this kind of jump in here and make some closing thoughts and do a prayer for us?
Okay, so thank you, Dr. John, for this wonderful teaching and for answering some of our questions. With absence of questions, can I ask Leslie Okasa Ashon to close us with a word of prayer, if he's around?
Okay, let's go to God in prayer. Father Lord, we thank you for such a fruitful meeting that we could gather at your feet to learn. I pray that this class